In this lecture, let's have a high-level overview of what is NgRx effect and when do we need it in our NgRx application. Now, in order to understand NgRx effect, first we need to understand what is an effect. An effect refers to the change made to external variables, asynchronous HTTP calls, or file manipulation. Any change made to external variables other than the application state is an effect. So, for example, when we load data from the backend API by making an API call, or when we send some data to the server or update data on the server, again by making an API call, that is a side effect. Also, the authentication and authorization which we perform from our application, that is also a side effect. So the login functionality which we have added in our Angular application, that is making an API call. It is making an API call to Firebase Auth API, right? And since it is making an API call, it is a side effect. Also, whenever we upload or download files, so any interaction with file system or cloud storage, that is also a side effect. Also, interaction with browser APIs like the geolocation API or the notification API, that is also a side effect. And also, when you have a series of asynchronous steps that depends on each other, whenever you have some asynchronous code which you are executing, that is also a side effect. So any change made to an external variable is a side effect. Now, when we work with the reducer, using the reducer, we simply change the application state, and the application state is present in memory. So using reducer, we do not change any external variable. We do not make any API call or write something in the file or read something from the file, etc. Reducers are pure functions which does not manipulate external variables. It is simply used to create a new state and update the store with the new state. But if any action involves an API call or asynchronous code execution or working with file system, that is a side effect, and that should be handled by NgRx effect and not with reducer functions. So NgRx effects are the mechanism to isolate, manage and execute side effects. Just now we learned what a side effect is. An API call is a side effect. Working with file system is a side effect. Asynchronous code execution is a side effect. And NgRx effects are used to handle those side effects. So NgRx effects are nothing but injectable services that listens for dispatched actions, and when a relevant action occurs, it performs a side effect. Now here, there are few points which you need to understand. First of all, NgRx effect is nothing but it is an Angular injectable service. And also, just like reducer, an NgRx effect also listens for a dispatched action. And when that action happens, what it does, it performs a side effect, like it makes an API call or it executes some asynchronous code, etc. Basically, it performs a side effect. And after the side effect completes, it typically dispatches a new action to update the store with the result. So another point which you need to remember here is the NgRx effect, it does not update the state directly. Instead, what it does is, once it has handled an action by doing some side effects, it dispatches another action. And when that action is dispatched, it will be handled by the reducer, which in turn will update the state. So NgRx effect will not change the state directly. The state will always be changed by the reducer. But in order to call the reducer function, once the effect is complete using the NgRx effect, the NgRx effect is going to dispatch another action which will be handled by the reducer to update the state. And that we will understand in a bit with a diagram. So remember that a reducer is a pure function that takes the current state and an action to produce a new state. We have already seen this in our previous lectures. And since a reducer is a pure function, we should not perform any asynchronous operation or side effects inside a reducer. The job of reducer is to simply return a new state and update the store with the new state data. On the other hand, an effect is where the asynchronous operations and side effects are handled. So if you want to make an API call, it should be done inside an effect and not inside a reducer. Just like reducer, an effect also listens to a dispatched action, and based on the action type, an effect is called and executed. So both reducer and effect is used to handle an action, but both of them handles them in a slightly different way. Effect will handle those actions which involves a side effect, but reducer will handle those actions which simply involve state change. It does not involve any side effects. So let's try to understand how effect works in NgRx with this diagram. So let's say we have two components in our Angular application, header component and login component. We also have a store where we have a state called logged user, and initial value of this logged user is null. And we also have a selector to get the current value of that logged user. Now in the header component, we want to use the details of the logged user. So we are using the selector to fetch the detail of the logged user in the header component. Now from the login component, whenever a user tries to log in, he will enter his email and password and click on the login button. And when the login button is clicked, here we are dispatching an action called loginStart. So you can see in the actions we have created three actions: login start, login success, and login failed. So when the login button is clicked, we are dispatching login start action. Now this login start action, it involves an API call, because whenever we are going to log in a user, we are going to make an API call. In our example, we are going to make an API call to Firebase Auth API, right? And since in order to handle this action, it involves an API call, it involves a side effect, that action will be handled by the effect, the NgRx effect. So you can see this effect is going to handle the login start action. Okay. Now, once the effect has handled the side effect, that means it has sent an API call to Firebase Auth API and it has received the response, the effect is complete. Once the response is received, so if the user is logged in successfully, we are going to receive a success response. If there has been some error, in that case, we will receive a error response. So in both cases, we are going to receive some response. So if the login was successful, this effect is going to dispatch another action. If the login is successful, it is going to dispatch login success action. But if the login has failed, it is going to dispatch login failed action. So one of these two actions will be dispatched by this effect. Let's say the login was successful. So what this effect will do is it is going to dispatch login success action. And this login success action, it does not involve any side effect. It does not involve any API call or any asynchronous code execution. When this login success action is dispatched, it is simply going to change the current state. It is going to change the logged user and it is going to assign it with the details of the currently logged in user. So since this action does not involve any API call, this action will be handled by the reducer. Okay, so once the side effect is complete, once the login is complete, the NgRx effect in this example can either dispatch a login success action or login fail action. And both of them will be handled by this reducer because they do not involve any side effect. All right, in our example, we are assuming that the login was successful. So the effect has dispatched login success. So now this reducer is going to handle that login success action. And with that action, let's say we are also passing the logged in user data. So this reducer is going to take that logged in user data and it is going to update the store, and there it is going to update this logged user state with the details of the logged in user, the data which has been dispatched with the login success action. So I hope this flow is clear. And we are going to implement NgRx effect in our next lecture, so we will also understand this practically. But I hope this diagram has given you a high level overview of how NgRx effect works and how NgRx differentiate whether an action should be handled by an effect or by a reducer. So to summarize, remember that We use reducer to handle an action when no side effect is involved. Reducer is the one which is responsible for updating the current state by returning a new state. On the other hand, we use effects to handle an action when a side effect like API call, file handling, logging, etc. is involved. Once the side effect is handled, the NgRx effect dispatches a new action to update the state, and that dispatched action will be handled by the reducer. So this was a very high level overview of what NgRx effect is and when do we need it. In the next lecture, we are going to implement NgRx effect practically. So this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.